This sermon started at the Social Justice Service auction last spring. My donation to the auction was offering to the highest bidder the right to suggest a sermon topic. And the winner of that auction asked for a sermon on stigma and mental illness. Nobody doubts that this stigma exists. You can read about it as far back as the Bible. And these days you can see it on letterheads and hospital directories. Mental health has been renamed behavioral health lately, as if it has something to do with kindergarten report cards, or the only thing we care about is not how a person feels, but just what they do. The revenge of insurers and managed care companies who are being required these days to treat mental and physical health with more parity. At least that's my suspicion. A sermon is not merely a lecture teaching us about something, but always at some level an invitation to open our hearts and change our own lives. So I hope you will go away this morning with a more open heart towards people suffering from mental illness. And I hope you'll resolve to do a few simple things that you can do to reduce the stigma of mental illness and treatment. And I hope you'll go away with a softer attitude towards your own fluctuating mental health and wellness. Because the fact of the matter is that many of us cope with mental health issues during our lives, and those who suffer are persons of worth and dignity, often loved and loving, always human beings. So let's start by hearing a song that expresses some of the anguish and humanity of mental illness. Find great music for this week. I was volunteering in a kids group once, and I made a suggestion that was a little too out of the box for the group think of the morning, and they all stared at me, a clueless grown-up. And one kid said, "Are you mental?" Now, I got the general's tone of scorn, but I was not only out of the box, but I was out of lingo sync with these kids, and I had never heard that phrase before, and it showed. And another kid came to my rescue. "He means, like crazy, like I really don't think we can do this." And we went on from there. But it got me thinking. I mean, after all, we're all mental. A combination of mind and body that can't be teased apart. Physical wellness deteriorates a lot when mental wellness deteriorates. And our mental wellness is a very physical thing. I learned this in a very dramatic way when I was pregnant. I had gone into premature labor and they were trying to stop it. They told me that they were going to give me a drug that would cause me to become anxious, but not worry. That would be unpleasant, but it was all the drug and it would be over shortly and I shouldn't worry. And what me worry? I mean, anything for a healthy baby, right? And besides, I thought, as they were putting in the IV, if I know that nothing is really wrong, I won't have any reason to feel anxious, right? Well, wrong. Just take it from me. And every time since, when someone has said to me, "I know I really don't have anything to be anxious about, but I can't help it," or I've said to myself, "I am so lucky, safe, loved, there is no reason at all for me to feel so depressed," I have remembered that half hour of pure, heart-pounding anxiety, drug-induced, 7 weeks before Kevin was actually born. Knowing that it was just a physical thing helped a little. Mental and physical, we're all twined. We are all mental. Now, I know that's really not what that kid meant. Mental was a slang shorthand for mentally ill, and not a very nice one either. We're not all mentally ill, but a lot of us have experienced mental illness, or cope with poor mental health, or have a mental condition that we keep in check with medication or lifestyle, or we will sometime in our lives. Something's happened to this sermon. Oh gosh. I've lost all my statistics. Oh no. Okay, so let me think if I remember this. 1/4 of all Americans are diagnosed with some form of a mental illness or condition every year. And about 49% of us experience some kind of diagnosed mental condition during our lifetimes. Of all sufferers of mental problems, about 6% are considered to be severely debilitated by their illness. While these folks, who are often too ill to work regularly, sometimes are out of touch with reality, can't manage helpful relationships or control their own behavior well, and these are the people we tend to think about when we think of mental illness. That's really very unrealistic, because mental health is a bell curve, like physical health. A few people are very ill, a few are shiningly healthy, most of the rest of us fall somewhere in between. So mental disorders would affect 20 people in this room this morning, right now, and perhaps 60 of the people in this room during our lifetimes, and a similar proportion of our parents, children, and family members. If this congregation was a typical group of people, all told, we could expect a couple of dozen people in the families of this congregation to have a severe mental illness. Are you surprised at these numbers? And these statistics don't count substance abuse by itself, or the depressions, anxieties, and compulsions which trouble us, but not quite enough to count as a disorder. In other words, over a lifetime, mental illness affects about as many people as cancer, about half of us, more women than men, or affects about as many people as heart disease does, a little under half of us, more men than women. Most sufferers of cancer and heart disease recover. Likewise, most sufferers of mental illness recover. A combination of treatment, time, and lifestyle changes do their work, and the patient returns to the ranks of the healthy, sometimes with some lingering impairments, usually with some new pills to take, and often worried about a recurrence. Like cancer and heart disease, mental illness causes a lot of suffering, does a lot of economic damage, and sometimes kills. 90% of persons who commit suicide have a diagnosable mental illness. And often people who are struggling with mental illness don't take good care of themselves, and that leads to physical health complications. Unlike heart or cancer patients, however, mental health patients not only deal with their illness, they deal with stigma. Stigma is a negative prejudice that falls on people in a certain group, defining them as inferior or irresponsible or dangerous or scary, losers, so on, just because of one characteristic. It's a big burden. It's an awful load to dump on somebody who already has a health issue to deal with. You were probably surprised at the prevalence of mental health conditions and illness in the population. One problem with stigma is that the people who are in the stigmatized group don't talk about it. Naturally enough, they want to sidestep that burden whenever they can. That deprives them of support and those around them of opportunities to realize that their prejudices are wrong and harmful. Stigma makes it harder for people to consider getting treatment. It makes it easier for the government or the taxpayers or the insurance companies to deny treatment, and it makes it harder for those who need treatment to accept it. It's sort of like the stigma that used to go with cancer, that used to be discussed only in whispers and thought to be contagious even by otherwise educated people. Some of us old-timers remember a little bit of that. Relaxing the stigma on cancer was a huge relief for cancer sufferers. People started seeking treatment earlier, getting more support from friends and family. During my lifetime, cancer has become pretty much normal, one of those things that just happens to people. During my lifetime, the stigma of mental illness has lessened, but not so much. New laws have had an impact on some of the worst discrimination that persons suffering from mental illnesses used to have. You can't refuse to rent an apartment or give a job to an otherwise qualified person just because they have a diagnosis with a mental illness, and soon you won't be able to deny them insurance. In November 2010, the state of Kansas's voters removed a piece of their state constitution which permitted the legislature to remove the right to vote from persons diagnosed as mentally ill. That wasn't that long ago. The arc of justice is definitely moving in the right direction, but stigma remains. Laws don't completely cure discrimination, of course, but the stigma that remains for those suffering mental illness is often social and linguistic in nature. We're not always open-hearted to people who suffer from mental illness in our friendship circles, our workplaces, or on our streets. Some kinds of mental illness scare us, and most of us have difficulty being kind when we're scared. That boy who called me mental because my idea wasn't very well thought out, I admit it wasn't a very good idea, but he had taken a technical word, mentally ill, and applied it to something really very different, out-of-the-box thinking, or to be less kind, stupid idea. He and his peers were not alone in this. Our language has a whole set of words which are applied to both mental illness and, let's just say, sloppy or disordered thinking. Words like crazy, lunatic, demented, cracked, nuts, mad. Now, in my dictionary, none of those words are appropriately applied to mental illness or people suffering from them, but popularly speaking, they often are. The most denigrating usage of all is probably talking about the mentally ill, as if they were alike enough and debilitated enough that they could all be lumped into one all-defining category, as if nothing else in their lives mattered. We don't talk about the cancerous or the heart diseased as categories of human beings. We give those sufferers the dignity of having an illness as one part of themselves, not being an illness and nothing else. Part of being open-hearted to others and being a part of the arc of justice is watching our language. There's not a person here who calls an African-American man a boy, for instance. Most of us don't use the word men to refer to groups of males and females. We get it, that the words that we use matter, that they can put people down and keep society mired in its unjust ways. So let's lose the term the mentally ill. It's a hurtful term that's too broad to be useful in any way. That goes for specific diagnoses, too. To say that someone is schizophrenic or is bipolar is saying something like, that's the definition of you, and implies, and I don't care about anything else. People have schizophrenia, like they have cancer. It's a part of their lives. It may be a huge part of their lives, but it's not who they are. Some advocates for those suffering mental illness would like us to stop using words like crazy and mad altogether, but that would deprive us of words that refer to foolish and ill-considered thinking and other kinds of stupid ideas on the part of people who don't have a mental illness. And well, there's an awful lot of that going on, and we need all the words we can get. But we can certainly watch ourselves and scrupulously avoid using these words, these slang words, to refer to people who suffer from mental illness. And we gently insist that those around us do the same. As for the term mental, the further I got into writing the sermon, the more I regretted it, using it to anchor the sermon. For although it was useful in making some important points, really, mental illness isn't a slangy matter. So let's hear from a man about his experience with the stigma of mental illness. This appeared last month in the student newspaper at Harvard University.
In the fall of 2010, I moved to Cambridge to join the faculty of Harvard Divinity School. Fall and winter that year were horrible. The snowfall began in October and did not cease until late spring. The December dusk at 4 p.m. made me long for the Southern California sun that my family had walked away from, and I was having trouble keeping up with the frenetic pace of my new job. Yet the real problem was that I had become almost unrecognizable to my family. The hide-and-go-seek playing, flag football coaching, nightly dinner cooking father and husband had somehow become that cranky man who never came out of his office. By the spring, however, life was turning around. A dear colleague and friend referred me to Harvard University Behavioral Health Systems. To be sure, I was apprehensive. Where I come from, a genteel southern community outside of Atlanta, any conversation about mental health evokes images of straitjackets and padded walls. Nor did my faith community afford me, or anyone else, the freedom to hurt. Admitting that one is confused, burdened, or depressed is an anathema. You might as well show up in church and tell everyone that you are demon-possessed. Nevertheless, I sought counseling. When my first session ended, I felt normal for the first time in months. I was still stressed and fatigued, but my therapist helped me put these feelings in context. I learned how factors such as stress, insomnia, and even lack of sunlight are all tied to serotonin production. With regular visits and a treatment plan, I was soon back to my old self, maybe even a better self. 12 months later, I was awarded tenure and then named the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals and Pusey Minister of the Memorial Church. What a difference a year makes. I share this story not as a testimony of my accomplishments, but rather to reveal a subsequent moral lapse. I confess, I have not visited behavioral health all semester. Why? Because shame once again got the best of me. What would people think if they saw the Pusey minister of Memorial Church sitting in the behavioral health waiting room? This is the question that I asked myself. Thus, I requested that the receptionist provide me with the name of a healthcare provider outside of Cambridge. Yes, I had overcome the stigma of getting health, but the shame associated with public knowledge of receiving treatment remained. In my sermon last week, I heard myself saying, seeking help to manage stress, identify resources to alleviate anxiety, and even taking the appropriate doctor-prescribed medications to mollify mental illnesses are neither signs of weakness nor concessions to failure. Immediately, as the next line of the sermon poured from my lips, I realized the folly of my ways. I must practice what I preach and model the behaviors I encourage. Why should I care about who sees me at behavioral health? Instead, I should be inviting and encouraging others to come along. So, I made my appointment this week. Might you consider joining me?
Well, you know, that chaplain has a point. If we decide we're going to treat our own mental health challenges like we treat our physical health challenges and just come out and talk about it, braving prejudice when it happens, seeking treatment when we need it, and letting mental health just be a regular old part of our health, things will, in the end, be a lot easier for everybody. Normalizing mental illness and treatment and the lifestyle and medication adjustments that keep us well will only happen if ordinary people start talking about their whole lives, as this Harvard professor did. Another huge part of the stigma of mental illness comes from another sloppy use of language. That happens when there's a spectacular crime, like last week's shooting of 4 employees and the suicide of the shooter in Minneapolis. The media and the public speculate freely about the mental health of the shooter, which of course we rarely know anything about for days. And while it's true that the untreated mental health issues contribute to the crime rate, it's also true that the vast majority of people with mental illnesses, even very serious mental illnesses, are law-abiding citizens who really don't deserve to be tarred with the brush of violence every time somebody shoots up a crowd. The conversations that pop up when these tragedies occur give us all an opportunity to clean up our linguistic act, to share some of what we know with our friends, and advocate for effective mental health treatment. That's how stigma ends. As to how to end those mass shootings, given that all but a few shiningly healthy persons on that bell curve is capable of impulsive actions when under severe stress, we should probably do something about those increasingly destructive guns that pervade our society, but that's another sermon. So maybe you're one of those shiningly healthy persons who has no mental health worries at all, but probably not. I'm certainly not. I'm prone to depression, and I do the things I need to do to keep myself on track, just like I do what I need to do to keep my blood pressure in the healthy zone. Whatever you are prone to, I hope you do what you need to do to stay on track. I've heard from an unusual number of folks this week who knew I was preaching on this subject, and I was offered articles, testimonies, and they expressed their confidence that I'd say something useful because mental health issues are a big, but often hidden, painful deal in their lives. And so I want to end with a story. I did part of my training for ministry as a chaplain in a federal mental hospital in Washington, D.C. This was back in the day when people could be confined in mental hospitals for years, and my first assignment was to offer spiritual care on a ward of long hospitalized elderly patients, many of whom didn't talk at all, and all of whom came from a culture and a religious tradition, the South and the Black church, which I didn't know very much about. Nor did I know much about mental illness or aging, and I'm naturally shy. I was 26 years old. I wanted to help, but I had no earthly idea what to do when the door locked behind me every morning. What patients mostly wanted from me was cigarettes and lights. This was a long time ago. The whole social structure of the mental hospital revolved around smoking. As I struggled, I noticed with alarm an increasingly strong desire to do something I had never wanted to do before: smoke. And by increasingly strong, I mean overwhelming. My understanding of myself changed fundamentally that week. And then the weather turned miserably hot, and buckets of ice water appeared on that un-air-conditioned ward. And that day, one patient that I hadn't interacted with appeared at my side, looking at my misery and my frustration and my discomfort with compassion, and said, "Chaplain, honey, may I get you a cup of ice water?" She did, and we sat down and she told me a little bit of her story. She'd been a patient on that ward most of her life, since a mental breakdown following a rape. She had her good days and her bad days. This was just a good enough day that she noticed a suffering chaplain and did what she could to offer hospitality. I learned a lot that summer. First and foremost, though, that a diagnosis and a history and a label are only a part of the totality of a person's humanity, and that each and every one of us, healthy, well, ill, abled, disabled, each and every one of us has a way to serve, a life to live, a light to shine. If you remember that, you'll pick the right words, and you'll share what you need to share, and life will be a little bit better for an awful lot of folks, our neighbors. And that's what our closing song is about.
Let your little light shine, shine, shine. Let it shine all night long. Maybe someone down in the valley trying to get home. Maybe me, maybe you, and maybe your brother or your sister too. And maybe someone down in the valley trying to get home. Little light shine, shine, shine. Let it shine all night long. Maybe someone down in the valley trying to get home. Some people are scared of every little light shine, so we must share our light to Let your little light shine, shine, shine. Let it shine all night long. Maybe someone down in the valley trying to get home. Some people are lost in the dark. Let your little light shine to make it spark. There may be someone down in the valley trying to get home. Let your little light shine, shine, shine. Let it shine all night long. Maybe someone down in the valley trying to get home. Let your little light shine, shine, shine. Let it shine all night long. Maybe someone down in the valley trying to get home. There may be someone down in the valley trying to get home. There may be someone down in the valley trying to get home.
Go out in peace, and may love bless you and keep you until we gather again. And get your packets. Get your packets.